The invitation looked normal until I opened the second envelope. A bill. $789,000. Your entry fee, my sister texted, if you want to come. My parents backed her. It's fair, my mother said. They waited for me to argue. I didn't. I just smiled and sent one thing back. No message. No explanation. The next day, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Panic. Anger. Confusion. Because the fee they demanded wasn't the one they ended up dealing with. And the document I sent changed everything. What they didn't know was that I'd spent 5 years building a file while they spent 5 years believing I'd disappeared. 5 years of blocked calls, returned letters, and silence they mistook for surrender. They thought they were charging me to come home. They didn't know I'd already decided the price would be theirs to pay. And that the woman walking through their door wouldn't be the one they threw away, but the one who survived them, the one who'd become exactly what they swore I'd never be, the one who was about to walk into the hospital where my sister was bleeding out and see my mother's face when she read the name on the surgeon's coat, the name she'd erased, the daughter she'd replaced, the truth she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. And in that moment, in that single frozen second before the screaming started, before the lies collapsed, before the family I'd lost realized the family they'd kept was built on nothing but performance and fear, they would finally understand that the bill was never about money, never about entry, never about anything except the cost of looking away, and now, finally, impossibly, the debt was coming due. The invitation looked normal. Cream cardstock, embossed lettering, my sister's signature flourish on the envelope. Monica had always been the one who cared about presentation. I opened it at my kitchen counter, Nathan's coffee mug still steaming beside me, our golden retriever Hippocrates snoring under the table. You are cordially invited, it read, to the Willett family reunion. August 14th. The Hartford estate. I almost laughed. 5 years of silence, of blocked numbers and returned letters, and now an invitation like we were all normal people with normal wounds. I was about to toss it when I felt the weight shift. A second envelope, smaller, tucked behind the first. No card. No note. Just a bill. $789,000. Stamped in red at the top, your entry fee. My phone buzzed. A text from Monica, timed perfectly because Monica always had perfect timing. If you want to come. I stared at the number. Not random. Not exaggerated. $789,000, the exact amount of my medical school debt, the loans I'd clawed my way through alone after they cut me off. She'd remembered. Of course she had. She'd weaponized it. I called my mother. Old instinct, dying muscle. She answered on the second ring, voice careful, distant, the tone she used for difficult clients back when she did bookkeeping. Irene. Monica said you might call. Mom. The bill. You saw it? A pause. The sound of her switching the phone to her other ear, a habit she'd had my entire life. It's fair, she said. The same 2 words she'd used when I was 12 and Monica got the bigger bedroom because she needed the space. Your sister planned this whole reunion. The venue, the catering, the flights for everyone. She says you can afford it now. Doctor's salary. She's asking for $800,000 to attend a family dinner. Don't be dramatic. It's an entry fee. For the estate. She stopped. I could hear my father in the background, his low murmur, the way he always fed her lines when she ran out. It's fair, my mother repeated, firmer now. We've all contributed. Your Aunt Ruth put in $50,000. I gripped the counter. Ruth, who'd been my only family for 5 years, who'd cried at my wedding and sent me Sunday casseroles and knew exactly what Monica had done. Ruth wouldn't pay $50 to attend Monica's circus, let alone $50,000. But my mother wasn't lying. She was repeating. There was a difference, and that difference had defined my entire childhood. Your father agrees, Mom added, though Dad had never agreed with anything in his life, he'd simply stopped disagreeing with Monica decades ago. We're waiting for your response. They were waiting for me to argue. To beg. To perform the Irene they remembered, the quiet daughter who accepted the smaller slice, the later curfew, the empty seat at the science fair. They wanted me to prove I still wanted them, and the price tag was the test. I didn't argue. I smiled, actually smiled, alone in my kitchen, feeling the expression stretch my face in a way that felt new and dangerous. Then I opened my laptop. 3 clicks to access the cloud folder Nathan had helped me organize last spring. The one labeled Old Life. The one I'd told myself I'd never open unless I had to. I found the PDF in 30 seconds. Page 1, a formal complaint filed with the Oregon State Medical Board, dated October 2019. Page 2, a sworn affidavit from my dean confirming my legitimate leave of absence. Page 3, the email thread where Monica, using a fake name, had contacted the board attempting to revoke my medical license before I'd even earned it. She'd called it protecting the family from further embarrassment. The board had investigated her instead. I'd kept it all. Every document, every receipt, every piece of the architecture she'd built to destroy me. Nathan had called it insurance. I'd called it archaeology, digging up a civilization I'd buried alive. I attached the PDF to a blank email. No subject line. No message. No explanation. Just the document, all 47 pages, flying through the ether to my sister's inbox at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning. Then I poured Nathan's coffee into a travel mug, scratched Hippocrates behind the ears, and went to work. The first call came at 10:15. I was in pre-op, scrubbing in for a routine appendectomy, when my phone lit up with a Hartford area code. I let it ring out against the locker metal. The second call came at 10:23. Third at 10:31. By noon, I had 14 missed calls, 9 voicemails I didn't listen to, and a text from my mother that simply read, "How could you?" I could have answered. Could have explained that the document I'd sent was just the beginning, that I'd spent 5 years building a file while she'd spent 5 years building a lie. But silence had always been Monica's weapon, and I was learning to use it. At 2 p.m., my hospital pager went off, not a trauma activation, but Linda from administration, her voice tight. "Dr. Yolette, there's a man in the lobby insisting he speak with you. Security's involved. He says he's your father." I didn't go down. I finished my case. I updated my charts. I walked to the lobby at 4:30 like I had all the time in the world, and found my father sitting in a plastic chair between a vending machine and a potted fern, his face the color of old paper. He stood when he saw me, the way he always stood, needing to be the tallest thing in the room. But his hands shook. I'd never seen his hands shake. "Where did you get that document?" he demanded, though his voice cracked on the last word. "From the medical board," I said, calm, clinical, the voice I used for bad news. "Public record, Dad. Anyone can request it. Your sister says it's fabricated. She says you're trying to ruin her." "Is that what she says?" He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the peppermint he always chewed to hide the cigarettes Mom pretended not to know about. "She's hysterical, Irene. She's been crying for 6 hours. She can't breathe." "Your mother can't," he stopped. His eyes dropped to my badge, then rose to my face, then dropped again, the same pattern I'd watched him perform my entire life. Looking at me but never seeing me. Why now? After all this time? Why come after her now? I didn't answer. Because the answer wasn't for him, it was for the security guard hovering by the desk, for the nurse walking past with a wheelchair, for the audience that was always watching even when we pretended we were alone. The answer was in the document. In the timing. In the fact that Monica had panicked the moment she received it, which meant she knew exactly what she'd done and had simply never believed I'd keep the proof. My father's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and something in his face shifted, relief, then dread, then a careful blankness I'd learned to read long ago. "It's your mother," he said. "She says Monica's on her way here. She says Monica wants to apologize. In person. She says." He stopped again, reading something he didn't speak aloud. His thumb scrolled. His jaw tightened. "What does it say, Dad?" He looked up at me, and for one unguarded second, I saw it. The doubt. The first crack in a foundation he'd poured 35 years ago when he decided Monica was the daughter worth watching. He'd seen something in that text. Something that didn't fit. "She says," he repeated slowly, "that the reunion was never about the money. That the 800,000 was just a test. To see if you'd changed. If you'd become the kind of person who would." He frowned at the screen, scrolling back up. "This doesn't make sense. She says the real fee was something else. Something you already owed. But the invitation only had the one." He stopped. I watched him read it again, slower this time, his lips moving the way they did when he checked Mom's bookkeeping. The way they did when he was trying to find the error. And then I understood. The second envelope hadn't been the only hidden thing. Monica had sent two versions, one to me, one to our parents. The bill to me, to punish. A different message to them, to explain. But she'd mistimed her texts, or my father had read them out of order, or she'd simply never expected him to compare the two stories side by side in a hospital lobby while his other daughter stood in surgical scrubs with a badge that read Chief of Trauma Surgery. "Dad," I said, and the word felt strange in my mouth, and used muscle. "What else did Monica tell you about the reunion? What was the real reason?" He didn't answer. His phone buzzed again, a call this time, my mother's photo on the screen, the one from their anniversary cruise. He ignored it. The peppermint smell was stronger now, his hands shaking worse, and I realized he wasn't angry. He was afraid. Not of me. Of what he was about to learn. Behind him, through the lobby glass, I saw a sedan pull up too fast, tires squealing on wet pavement. Monica's car, the silver Lexus she'd bought with the divorce settlement from the husband she'd told everyone abandoned her. The husband who, I'd later learn, had left because he found her second phone, the one with the fake names, the fabricated documents, the years of careful destruction. She got out without closing the door. She ran toward the entrance in heels that clicked too loud on the concrete, her coat flying open, her face flushed with something that looked like panic but was probably performance. She'd always been the best performer in the family. My father turned to look. I watched him watch her. I watched his shoulders square, old instinct, the protector reflex that had never once activated for me. But then he looked back at me. At my badge. At the face he'd last seen 5 years ago, blurred by distance and Monica's stories and his own refusal to ask questions. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and I watched the math happen behind his eyes. The reunion that cost $800,000, the daughter who'd paid it without arguing, the document that appeared too fast to be fabricated, the sister who was running toward us now with tears already streaming down a face that had never cried without an audience. "Irene," he said, and my name sounded different in his mouth. Smaller. Uncertain. "What exactly is my daughter paying for?" The lobby door slid open. Monica's heels clicked across the tile. She was already speaking, already performing, already launching into the explanation she'd prepared, the test, the fee, the proof that I'd become dangerous, that I couldn't be trusted at the reunion, that the family needed protection from the doctor who'd abandoned them. But my father wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me. And in his hand, his phone still glowed with the text she'd sent him. The one that mentioned a second envelope he'd never received, a real fee he'd never seen, a version of the invitation that didn't match the one I'd opened at my kitchen counter that morning. Monica reached for his arm. He didn't move. She said his name, then mine, then something about lawyers and slander and family loyalty. Her voice rose, the way it always did when her stories started to fray. I said nothing. I let the silence do what I'd never been able to do myself. Hold the space until the truth became unavoidable. And then my pager went off. A real one this time, trauma activation, the sound that had pulled me from sleep 1,000 nights. I glanced at the screen, expecting the usual, MVC, blunt abdominal trauma, the rhythm of my real life. But the patient name stopped me cold. Willette, Gerald. Male, 62. Chest pain. Syncopal episode. ETA 4 minutes. I looked up at my father, still standing in front of me, still holding the phone with the text that didn't match. His face had gone gray. His left hand pressed against his sternum, the way he'd done at my high school graduation before deciding Monica's theater performance was more urgent. The way he'd done at my wedding, which he'd missed, which he'd never asked about. "Dad," I said, but my voice had changed too. Lost the clinical edge. Gained something older. "When did you last eat?" He opened his mouth. Closed it. His knees buckled, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a small collapse, the kind of thing that happened to real people with real hearts and real years of real mistakes. I caught him. Of course I did. I was the chief of trauma surgery, and he was falling, and my hands knew what to do before my heart could argue. Monica screamed. Security moved. The lobby became noise and motion and the practiced chaos of a hospital remembering its purpose. But I held my father's weight against my shoulder, felt his pulse racing through his shirt, and looked up to see the ambulance bay doors opening with the next wave of emergency, the next patient, the next chapter of a story that was nowhere near finished. My father's eyes found mine as I lowered him to the floor. His lips moved. No sound. But I read it anyway, the question he'd never asked, the 5 words he'd never spoken, the apology that was too small and too late and still not enough. Behind me, Monica's heels had stopped clicking. I didn't need to look to know she was watching. To know she'd already started calculating how to spin this, how to frame it, how to make my father's collapse into another chapter of her story instead of mine. But my father was still looking at me. Still holding my arm with a grip that felt like recognition. And in his pocket, his phone still glowed with the text that didn't match. The proof that Monica had sent 2 invitations, 2 versions, 2 truths, and that one of them was about to unravel everything. The paramedics burst through the doors. I handed my father to them with the efficiency that had made me chief, the precision that had saved 100 strangers. But as they loaded him onto the gurney, his hand found mine one last time, and I felt him press something into my palm. His phone. Unlocked. The text thread still open. I closed my fingers around it as they wheeled him away. Around the proof that my sister had built a reunion on a lie, that she'd charged me $800,000 for a crime I'd never committed, that she'd been hiding a second envelope with a second fee and a second story that even our parents hadn't seen. Monica stepped into my path as I straightened. Her makeup had smeared, the first time I'd seen her imperfect in 20 years. "You did this," she whispered, though there was no one close enough to hear. "You sent that document. You triggered him. If he dies." "He won't," I said, and my voice was steady because I'd spent 5 years learning steadiness in rooms exactly like this one. "I'm his doctor now. And his phone says you sent him a message about a second envelope that I never received. About a real fee that wasn't money." I held up the device, screen glowing, her words illuminated in black and white. "What was the real fee, Monica? What were you actually charging me for?" She went still. The calculation flickered behind her eyes, the same look I'd seen at the kitchen table in Hartford when Dad read my medical school acceptance letter. The look of a sister measuring whether the truth or the lie would serve her better. Behind her, through the glass, I saw another car pull up. My mother's sedan, moving too slow, as if she already knew. As if someone had warned her that the reunion she'd planned was already collapsing, that the daughter she'd chosen was already exposed, that the family she'd built on silence was about to learn exactly what silence had cost them. Monica opened her mouth to answer. To spin. To perform one more time. But my pager went off again, not trauma, not emergency, just a message from Nathan, simple and sharp, check your email. Now. The document you sent? Someone else just sent the same file to every address on the reunion list. All 47 people. Including Mom. Including Ruth. Someone who had access to your cloud folder. I looked at Monica. She looked at the phone in my hand, at the message glowing on its screen, at the proof that was already spreading beyond our control. And for the first time in 35 years, my sister had no smile ready. No story prepared. No lie that would fit. Because the person who'd sent that document to 47 people wasn't me. And the only other person with access to my cloud folder was standing in the lobby behind her, wearing a hospital badge that read Legal Affairs, holding a coffee mug I'd bought him 2 anniversaries ago, watching us both with the calm, certain eyes of a man who'd finally decided that 5 years of silence was enough. Nathan didn't wave. He didn't move. He just held my gaze across the chaos of the lobby and mouthed 2 words that changed everything. I caught Nathan's eyes across the lobby and something shifted in my chest, not relief, not yet, but the first loosening of a knot I'd carried for 5 years. Monica followed my gaze, her body turning in a sharp, defensive arc, and I watched the moment she understood. Her mouth opened, then closed, the calculation failing, the script blank. She'd spent her entire life controlling the narrative, and now the narrator had changed. My father's phone was still warm in my palm, the text thread glowing with evidence that didn't care about her performance. I tucked it into my scrub pocket and moved toward Nathan, not running, not walking, moving with the purpose that had carried me through 1,000 emergency rooms. Monica grabbed for my arm, her nails catching the fabric of my sleeve, but I pulled away without breaking stride. The gesture cost her nothing and cost her everything. It was the first time I'd ever refused her touch without explanation. Nathan met me at the corridor entrance, his face calm, his lawyer's mask in place, but his hands were shaking. Not from fear. From anger held too long. Conference room, he said, low enough that only I could hear. 3rd floor. Ruth is already there. I stopped walking. Ruth? She got the email 20 minutes ago. She called me, not you. She knew you'd be in surgery. He glanced back at the lobby, where Monica stood frozen between the vending machine and the potted fern, my father's phone still clutched in her hand like a weapon she'd forgotten how to use. She's been waiting for this, Irene. Your aunt. She's been waiting longer than you know. The elevator doors opened and I stepped in, Nathan beside me, the space between us charged with everything we hadn't said in the 5 years of our marriage. He'd never pushed me to confront my family. Never suggested I keep the files, build the case, prepare for war. He'd simply helped me organize the documents, set up the cloud folder, create the system that now had a life of its own. I'd thought he was being supportive. I was only now realizing he'd been strategic. Why didn't you tell me? I asked as the elevator climbed. He pressed the button for the 3rd floor twice, an old nervous habit. Because you needed to send that document yourself. Not for me. For you. The doors opened and he stepped out, turning back just long enough to meet my eyes. But when I saw her car pull up, when I saw her running in here to perform, I decided 5 years of watching you bleed was enough. The conference room was small, institutional, a table that seated 6 and a window that looked out at the parking lot where my father's sedan still sat crooked in the handicapped space. Ruth stood at the window, her back to the door, her shoulders rigid beneath a coat I'd seen her wear to my wedding. She didn't turn when we entered. She spoke to the glass. Your mother just called me. She said Monica told her you were trying to extort the family. That the $800,000 was your idea, that you'd threatened to release false documents if we didn't pay. Ruth's voice was steady, but her hands pressed flat against the window frame, the knuckles white. I told her that was interesting. Because I'd just received an email with your files attached. And the sender wasn't you. I moved to the table, pulled out a chair, sat down. My legs were steady. My hands were steady. Everything was steady except my breathing, which had gone shallow and fast, the way it did before a difficult intubation. Who sent it? Ruth turned. Her face was older than I'd allowed myself to notice, the skin loose around her jaw, the eyes sunken with sleeplessness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with witness. She'd watched my family destroy me. She'd watched me rebuild. She'd watched Monica perform at every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every funeral where my name was whispered like a ghost story. And she'd stayed silent because I'd asked her to. Because I'd told her I didn't need revenge. I needed peace. Nathan sent it, Ruth said. But he didn't write it. I looked at my husband. He sat down across from me, pulled a laptop from his bag, opened it without meeting my eyes. The screen glowed with an email draft, timestamped 3 a.m., dated 3 weeks ago. The subject line read, "The full account." The body was empty except for a single attachment. The same PDF I'd sent Monica that morning. But the sender field showed a name I didn't recognize. An address I didn't know. "I found it in your cloud folder last month," Nathan said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard without touching it. "You'd labeled it Old Life." I labeled the copy Insurance. I didn't read it until 2 weeks ago. Not all of it. Just enough to understand that Monica didn't just lie to your parents. She didn't just ruin your residency graduation or your wedding or 5 years of holidays. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were wet, the lawyer's mask cracking at the edges. "She paid someone, Irene. A private investigator in Portland. $20,000, wired from her personal account, to find evidence that you were actually failing medical school. That Sarah's cancer was a cover story. That you'd invented the whole thing to hide your," he stopped. Swallowed. "To hide your supposed drug problem." The investigator came back with nothing. Because there was nothing. But Monica didn't stop paying him. She kept him on retainer for 3 years. 3 years of someone watching you, photographing you, following you to the hospital, to our apartment, to Sarah's funeral, I finished, and my voice was flat, emptied out by the image of a stranger in the back pew of that chapel, counting the empty rows, documenting my grief for my sister's files. He was there. I remember him. A man in a brown coat who left before the service ended. Ruth moved from the window, pulled out the chair beside me, sat down close enough that I could smell her perfume. The same scent she'd worn when I was 12, when she'd been the only one at my science fair, when she'd bought me ice cream and told me that some parents only had enough attention for one child and that it wasn't my fault. She'd been wrong about that. It had been my fault. I'd let Monica convince me that wanting attention was the same as being selfish. The email went to 47 people, Ruth said, her hand finding mine on the table. Not just family. Monica's colleagues from Stanford. Her ex-husband's parents. The board members of the charity she chairs. People who've only ever seen her version of the story. She squeezed my fingers, hard, the way she'd squeezed them at my wedding when Nathan's father walked me down the aisle. But there's something else. Something Nathan didn't put in the email. Something I found last week, when I finally decided to stop being careful. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, slid it across the table. Manila, unlabeled, the kind of folder that held nothing important until you opened it and discovered it held everything. I flipped it open. The first page was a bank statement. Monica's name at the top. A wire transfer for $50,000, dated 6 months ago, to an account in Hartford I didn't recognize. "That's not the investigator," Ruth said. "That's something new. Someone local." I traced it to a medical billing company. Small, private, handles accounts for 3 hospitals in Connecticut. She paused, her eyes finding mine with the weight of what she hadn't yet said. "Including Mercy Rest, Irene." The hospital where you work. Where you're chief. I stared at the numbers. The dates. The pattern that was forming before I had words for it. Monica had paid someone at my hospital. 6 months ago. While I was operating. While I was saving strangers. While I was building the life she'd told everyone I'd abandoned. What did she buy? I asked, but my voice had gone distant, clinical, the tone I used when a patient's injuries were worse than the scan suggested. Ruth reached over, flipped to the second page. A screenshot of an internal MercyRest database. Patient records. My patient records. Accessed by a user ID I didn't recognize, at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, 6 months ago. The records were mine. Not from my trauma service. From my personal file. The one that documented my history, my leave of absence, my reinstatement, my promotion to chief. The file that proved, officially and permanently, that I'd never dropped out. That I'd never failed. That I'd never been anything except exactly what I claimed to be. She was looking for the same thing the investigator couldn't find, Nathan said, his voice quiet, controlled, the way it got when he was preparing for a closing argument. Evidence of failure. Proof that you were a fraud. Something she could use to update the story, to keep it alive, to make sure that even if your parents ever doubted, she'd have fresh ammunition. He closed the laptop, the click loud in the small room. But she found the opposite. She found your file. Clean. Documented. Unimpeachable. And instead of accepting that, The conference room door opened. We all turned, 3 heads moving as one, expecting security, expecting Monica, expecting my mother with her careful voice and her switched phone and her refusal to see what didn't fit. It was Linda. My charge nurse. Her face flushed, her badge crooked, her eyes finding mine with the urgency of someone who'd run up 3 flights of stairs. Dr. Yolette, she said, breathless. You need to come. Now. It's your father. I was moving before she finished, out the door, down the corridor, Nathan and Ruth behind me, the folder still on the table, the laptop still open, the evidence still spreading through inboxes across Hartford. The elevator was too slow. I took the stairs, 2 at a time, my scrub bottoms flapping, my heart rate climbing in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the possibility that I'd waited too long. That I'd sent the document to punish and hadn't considered what punishment might cost. The cardiac unit was on the 2nd floor. I pushed through the doors and saw my mother first, sitting in the same plastic chair my father had occupied in the lobby, her hands clasped, her lips moving in prayers she'd stopped believing in decades ago. She looked up when I entered, and her face did something complicated. Relief, guilt, anger, the same cocktail I'd seen at every family gathering where Monica was the center and I was the shadow. Where is he? I asked, not stopping, not waiting for permission. Room 4, my mother whispered. The doctor said, he said it was stress-induced. A cardiac event. Not a full infarction but, she stopped, her eyes moving past me to Ruth, who had just entered the room. Something passed between them, something old and bitter and female, the history of 2 sisters-in-law who'd chosen different sides of a war. You brought her, my mother said, and the whisper became accusation. You brought Ruth here. To my husband's bedside. I'm his doctor, I said, not turning around. I don't need permission to treat my patient. And I don't need your approval to bring my family. The word landed. My family. Not hers. Not the one she'd built with Monica at the center and me at the periphery. The one I'd built with Nathan and Ruth and the colleagues who'd chosen me, the friends who'd shown up, the life that existed despite her absence rather than because of her attention. I pushed into room 4. My father lay on the bed, oxygen cannula in his nose, monitors beeping in steady rhythm, his face pale but his eyes open. They found me immediately, tracked me across the room, held on with a focus I'd never experienced from him before. Not at my graduation, absent. Not at my wedding, absent. Not at any of the moments that should have mattered. But here, now, in a hospital bed with his own mortality beeping on the screen beside him, he saw me. Irene, he said, and my name sounded different. Smaller. Uncertain. The way it had sounded in the lobby before his knees buckled. I moved to the monitor, checked the numbers, verified what the attending had already documented. Stable vitals. Elevated troponin. Stress cardiomyopathy, the broken heart syndrome that wasn't poetic but was real, that happened to people who'd spent decades refusing to feel until the feeling finally forced its way through. You're going to be fine, I said, clinical, distant, the voice I used for patients I didn't know. The episode was acute but not catastrophic. We'll monitor for 24 hours. After that, you'll need follow-up with a cardiologist. Not me. Someone unconnected. Irene, he said again, and this time he reached for my hand. I let him touch me. I didn't return the pressure. The text. The one Monica sent. About the second envelope. I need to tell you. You don't need to tell me anything, I said, pulling my hand away to adjust his foreline, to check his drip rate, to do anything that required my eyes to focus on equipment instead of his face. Nathan already explained. There were 2 versions of the invitation. 2 fees. 2 stories. Monica sent me the bill and sent you the explanation. She was testing whether I'd fight, whether you'd defend her, whether the family would close ranks one more time. I stepped back from the bed, finally meeting his eyes. She didn't expect you to compare the 2. She didn't expect you to notice the discrepancy. And she certainly didn't expect you to collapse in a hospital lobby while holding the proof. My father's face crumpled. Not dramatically. Not performatively. Just a slow collapse of features too tired to maintain the mask anymore. I didn't know, he said, and the words were so familiar, so worn, that I almost laughed. I'd heard them at every missed event, every ignored achievement, every moment where Monica's version of reality had been accepted without question. I didn't know you wanted me there. I didn't know you were hurt. I didn't know she was lying. You knew, I said, and the clinical distance cracked, letting something harder through. You knew when you blocked my number. You knew when you returned my letter. You knew when you skipped my residency graduation and my wedding and 5 years of Sundays when I sat by my phone waiting for a call that never came. I leaned closer, close enough to smell the hospital soap on his skin, the same soap I'd used an hour ago before his collapse. You knew, Dad. You just chose not to know. There's a difference. The monitor beeped faster. His heart rate climbing. I should have stepped back. Should have called for the attending, should have remembered that I was his doctor and that doctors didn't confront patients at bedside, didn't use medical access as emotional leverage, didn't. I chose wrong, he said, and the words stopped me. Not because they were apology. Because they were fact, delivered without performance, without audience, without Monica's careful framing. Just 3 words, flat and final, from a man who'd spent his life building sentences that could be revised, retracted, reinterpreted. I chose wrong, and I kept choosing wrong because choosing right would have meant admitting I'd been wrong all along. And I couldn't, he stopped, his hand pressing against his chest, the monitors beeping louder. The second envelope. Monica told me it was a legal document. A release form. Something you needed to sign to attend the reunion. To prove you wouldn't sue the family. To prove you'd accepted responsibility for what you'd done. I stared at him. For what I'd done? For leaving, he said, and his eyes filled, not with tears but with the effort of holding them back. For abandoning us. For choosing medical school over your family. He stopped again, the sentence breaking against the rocks of his own logic. She said you'd agreed to pay the entry fee as proof of good faith. But the real condition was the release. The admission. He reached beneath his pillow, pulled out an envelope, cream cardstock, embossed with the same flourish as the invitation. smaller than mine. Different contents. He held it out with a hand that shook worse than Nathan's had in the conference room. I didn't take it. Not yet. I looked at the door, where I knew Nathan and Ruth were standing just out of sight, where my mother was probably still praying, where Monica was certainly still calculating her next move. I looked at my father's face, gray and desperate and finally honest. And I understood that this envelope was the key to everything. Not the bill. Not the document I'd sent. This. The thing Monica had hidden from me. The thing she'd told my father was my confession. My admission of guilt. My signed agreement that I was the daughter who'd abandoned them, not the daughter they'd thrown away. What does it say? I asked, though I already knew. I'd known since I was 12 and Monica got the bigger bedroom. Since I was 14 and my science fair ribbon went unasked about. Since I was 26 and sitting on a hospital floor in Portland with a dead phone and a dying friend and a sister who was already building the story that would erase me. My father didn't answer. He pressed the envelope harder against my hand, his fingers cold, his pulse visible in the vein at his temple. Read it, he whispered. Not for me. For you. For what she tried to make you sign without knowing. For what she was going to do with it after you. The door opened. I didn't turn. I knew the step, the rhythm, the weight of presence that had dominated every room we'd ever shared. Monica entered without knocking, without asking, without any of the deference that hospital protocol required. She moved to the bedside opposite me, her eyes flicking from my father to the envelope to my face, calculating the damage, measuring the exposure, recalibrating the story. Dad, she said, her voice honeyed with concern, the same tone she'd used when she called our parents to report my supposed dropping out. You shouldn't be agitated. The doctor said. I am the doctor, I said, not looking at her. And this patient is in my care. You need to leave. I need to, she stopped. The performance faltered, just for a second, the mask slipping to show the panic beneath. That's my father. I've been his daughter for 35 years. You don't get to decide who. I decide who stays in my patient's room, I said, finally turning to face her. And right now, you're creating a hostile environment that is medically contraindicated for his recovery. I stepped toward her, close enough to smell her perfume, the expensive one she'd started wearing after her divorce, the one that smelled like money and victory and carefully manufactured grief. But more importantly, Monica, I decide what happens to this envelope. The one you told Dad was my legal release. The one you were going to use to prove I'd admitted to abandoning the family. The one that would have let you keep the story alive forever, even if they eventually learned the truth about medical school. I held it up between us, cream cardstock catching the fluorescent light. What does it actually say, Monica? What did you put in here that I was supposed to sign without reading? Her face went white. Not pale. White. The color of a monitor flatline, of a page with no words, of a story that had finally reached its end. She reached for the envelope, her hand shaking worse than our father's, but I pulled it back, just out of reach, the way she'd pulled back attention and approval and every family gathering for my entire life. Irene, she said, and my name in her mouth was poison, had always been poison. The nickname she'd twisted into something smaller and weaker than it was. You don't understand. That document, it's for protection. For the family. For you, I finished. Always for you. I turned back to my father, who was watching us both with the expression of a man who'd built his life on one daughter's stories and was only now seeing how the other daughter had survived without them. I'm going to read this now, Dad. And then I'm going to decide what happens next. Not Monica. Not you. Me. I opened the envelope. The document inside was 3 pages, legal-sized, dense with text that had clearly been drafted by someone who understood contracts. Someone who understood how to make a signature bind, how to make an admission permanent, how to make a lie into a legal fact that could never be undone. I scanned the first paragraph, the second, the third. My hands began to shake. Not from fear. From recognition. It was a confession. A full, legal, notarized confession to crimes I hadn't committed. Drug use. Academic fraud. Identity theft. The fabrication of medical records. The harassment of family members. A litany of sins that Monica had invented, attributed to me, and prepared for my signature. At the bottom, a notary block. A witness line. A space for my initials on every page. And at the very end, a single clause that stopped my breath. By signing this document, the undersigned agrees to surrender all medical licenses, certifications, and professional credentials, and further agrees to cease all contact with the Willett family, their associates, and their designated representatives, in perpetuity. She hadn't just wanted to keep the story alive. She'd wanted to erase me completely. To make me not just absent but illegal. To turn my survival into a crime and my success into fraud. To ensure that even if our parents eventually learned the truth about medical school, they'd have this, my signed confession, to prove that I was still the monster she'd always claimed. I looked up from the page. Monica had backed against the wall, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes darting between me and our father and the door. She was calculating whether to run, whether to scream, whether to perform one more time and hope that performance could outlast the evidence. Nathan, I called, not turning around, knowing he was just outside, knowing he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. Get in here. Bring Ruth. And call hospital security. I have a notarized document that constitutes criminal fraud, attempted extortion, and conspiracy to commit professional sabotage. I folded the confession carefully, precisely, the way I'd learned to fold surgical drapes. And Monica? You should probably call your lawyer. The one who drafted this for you? I'm going to need his name too. She slid down the wall. Not dramatically. Just a slow collapse, the way our father had collapsed, the way all structures eventually collapsed when you removed the foundation of lies they'd been built on. Her coat fell open. Her phone fell from her pocket, screen up, glowing with a text thread I could read from where I stood. My mother's name at the top. The message timestamped 2 minutes ago, she has the envelope. She knows. Do something. I looked at my father. He was crying now, silent tears tracking down temples that had never learned to express grief. He reached for my hand again, and this time I let him take it. Not because the past was forgiven. Not because 5 years of absence could be erased by one moment of truth. But because in this room, at this moment, we were both seeing clearly for the first time. And clarity, however painful, was the only foundation anything real could be built on. I need you to rest now, I said, clinical again, but softer, the voice I used for patients who were going to survive. We'll talk more when you're stable. About the document. About what comes next. I stopped, my eyes catching on the monitor, on the steady beat that meant his heart was still working, still fighting, still capable of change. The door opened. Nathan entered first, Ruth behind him, security visible in the corridor. They stopped when they saw Monica on the floor, saw my father holding my hand, saw the envelope in my other fist. Irene? Nathan asked, his lawyer's mask slipping to show the husband beneath. What do you need? I looked at the confession in my hand. At my sister on the floor. At my father in the bed, finally seeing me. And I understood that this was the middle of the story, not the end. That revenge wasn't a document or a confrontation or a moment of public humiliation. Revenge was what came after. The life built on truth instead of lies. The family chosen instead of inherited. The silence that was finally mine to control. I need the original, I said, holding up the envelope. This is a copy. Monica always keeps the original. She kept the original of every lie she's ever told. I looked down at my sister, who had gone still against the wall, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow, performing unconsciousness the way she'd performed everything else. Where is it, Monica? The original confession. The one with the real notary stamp. The one you were going to file with the medical board after I signed this copy. She didn't answer. Her eyelids fluttered, the fake faint of a child who'd never learned that adults could see through performance if they bothered to look. I'll find it, Ruth said, moving to the door. Her apartment. Her office. Her safety deposit box. I've known her hiding places since she was 6 years old and stealing cookies from the jar. No, I said, and the word was sharp enough to stop her. Not yet. First, I need her to admit it. In front of witnesses. In front of Dad. In front of the security cameras that are recording every word in this room. I crouched beside Monica, close enough to smell her fear, the sour adrenaline beneath the expensive perfume. Open your eyes, sister. The performance is over. The audience has changed. And the only way you leave this room without handcuffs is if you tell me where the original is. Right now. While everyone is watching. Her eyes opened. Not dramatically. Just a slow reveal, the calculation still flickering, the machinery still grinding behind a face that had never learned to be honest. She looked at our father. At Nathan. At Ruth in the doorway. At the security guards whose presence she was only now registering. The house, she whispered, and the word cost her, I could see it cost her, the first true thing she'd spoken in decades. Mom's house. The basement. Behind the panel in Dad's workshop. There's a safe. The combination is my birthday. She laughed then, a broken sound, the first genuine emotion I'd ever heard from her. Of course it's my birthday. It was always my birthday. I stood up. The confession in my hand felt heavier than it should, 3 pages of lies that had nearly become legal truth. I handed it to Nathan, who took it with the care he used for evidence, for exhibits, for the documents that won cases and changed lives. Get the original, I said to Ruth. Take Nathan. Take security if you need to. And Ruth? I caught her arm as she turned to leave, felt the thinness of her bones, the fragility of the woman who'd been my only family for 5 years. Be careful. Monica wouldn't hide something this important without protection. Without. I know, Ruth said, and her eyes held something I hadn't seen before. Not just love. Not just loyalty. The cold satisfaction of a woman who'd been waiting 30 years to open a door that should never have been closed. She has cameras, Irene. She has a system. She has everything documented because she's always needed to control the narrative. Ruth smiled, small and sharp and nothing like the gentle aunt I'd known. But I have the Wi-Fi password. I installed the router when your mother couldn't figure out the manual. And I've been watching the feed for 6 months, waiting for the right moment. She left before I could answer. Nathan followed, his hand brushing mine in the doorway, a touch that held everything we didn't have time to say. The security guard stayed in the corridor, visible through the glass, witnesses to a scene that was already being recorded, already becoming evidence, already shifting from family tragedy to legal record. I turned back to my father. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something between pride and grief and the dawning understanding that he'd missed everything that mattered about the daughter he'd discarded. She's not going to jail, he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a plea, old instinct, the protector reflex that had never once activated for me but still fired automatically for her. I don't decide that, I said, checking his monitor, adjusting his drip, performing the doctor role that was real and solid and mine. The district attorney decides. The medical board decides. The 47 people who received Nathan's email decide what they believe, what they support, what they're willing to testify to. I met his eyes, let him see the distance that 5 years had built, the wall that his choices had constructed between us. But I decide whether to press charges for the fraud. For the conspiracy. For the years of professional sabotage that could have ended my career if she'd found anything real in my file. I paused, let the silence hold. And I haven't decided yet, Dad. That's the truth. I haven't decided whether mercy is something you deserve, or something I can afford, or something that would just let her start again in 5 years when you've all forgotten how close you came to losing everything. He closed his eyes. The monitors beeped. The room held its breath. And in the silence, my phone buzzed. A text from Ruth, timestamped 30 seconds ago, the words glowing with an urgency that turned my blood cold. Found the safe. Opened it. Irene. There's more than the confession in here. There's a file on you. Medical records. Psych evaluations. Things that don't exist. Things she manufactured. And there's a second file. On Dad. On Mom. On every family member who's ever crossed her. She's been building this for years. She's been ready for this war longer than any of us knew. I read it twice. 3 times. My hand steady, my breathing steady, everything steady except the understanding that was forming in the space between heartbeats. Monica hadn't just lied about me. She'd prepared for everyone. She'd built an arsenal of manufactured evidence, ready to deploy against anyone who threatened her position. The loyal daughter. The only one who stayed. The center of a family she'd created through elimination, through erasure, through the careful construction of enemies who couldn't defend themselves because they'd never been allowed to know they were under attack. I looked at my sister, still against the wall, her eyes open now, watching me read, watching me understand, watching me finally see the full scope of what I'd been fighting. She smiled. Small. Broken. But real. Now you know, she whispered, and her voice was sandpaper, stripped of performance, stripped of honey, just the raw edge of a woman who'd built a fortress and was finally being forced to look at what she'd stored inside. Now you know what I am. What I had to become. What you would have become if you'd stayed. If they'd loved you too. If you'd had to fight for every scrap of, she stopped, her hand pressing against her own chest, the same gesture our father had made, the same broken heart finding the same broken rhythm. I couldn't let you have it, Irene. The medical school. The pride. The version of you that they might have loved more than me. I couldn't. You couldn't let me exist, I finished, and the words were flat, factual, the diagnosis of a condition that had been terminal from birth. You couldn't share. Not the room. Not the attention. Not the story. Not anything. I crouched beside her again, close enough to see the pores of her skin, the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, the cost of maintaining a performance that had finally exceeded her ability to deliver. But here's what you don't understand, Monica. You didn't win. You didn't keep them. You didn't even keep the story. All you kept was the fear. The constant, grinding fear that someone would finally look in the safe. Open the files. See what you'd built. I stood up, stepped back, let the distance between us become permanent. And now someone has. And the war you prepared for? It's starting. But not on your terms. Not with your weapons. Not with your story. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Ruth, shorter, sharper. Coming back now. With everything. And Irene? The police are already downstairs. Someone called them. Not us. I looked at the door. At the corridor beyond. At the security guards who were suddenly alert, suddenly moving, responding to a radio call I couldn't hear. And then I understood. The police weren't here for Monica. Not yet. They were here for me. For the document I'd sent. For the email blast to 47 people. For the accusation that would be countered with accusation, the truth that would be buried under procedure, the story that would become a legal case before it could become a family reckoning. Monica had prepared for this too. Of course she had. She'd always known the safe might be found. She'd always had a backup plan. A counter-narrative. A way to turn exposure into victimhood, to make her own collapse look like my aggression, to frame the truth as an attack and the evidence as blackmail. I looked down at her. She was smiling now, the old smile, the one that stopped at the mouth while her eyes calculated the next move. "They'll believe me," she whispered. "They always believe me. You're the one who sent the threatening document. You're the one who caused Dad's heart attack. You're the one who..." "Who what?" I asked, and my voice was steady, 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 the way it had been in the operating room 5 years ago when I'd rebuilt a stranger's liver while my own family erased me. "Who told the truth? Who documented the lies? Who survived despite everything you tried?" I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the camera, held it where she could see. "Smile for the security footage, Monica. Because this is being recorded too. And the police downstairs? They're going to want to see this. All of it. The confession you tried to make me sign. The files you manufactured. The years of surveillance and sabotage and..." The door burst open. Not Ruth. Not Nathan. 2 officers in Hartford PD uniforms, hands on belts, eyes scanning the room, taking in the scene with the practiced speed of professionals who'd learned to assess threat in seconds. "Dr. Irene Yolette," the first one asked, and his voice was neutral, trained, giving nothing away. I turned to face him, my father's hand still warm in mine, my sister's confession in Nathan's possession, my aunt returning with evidence that would change everything. I looked at the officer, at his partner, at the corridor beyond where I could hear more footsteps, more voices, the machinery of legal process beginning to grind. "Yes," I said, and the word was simple, true, the first time I'd claimed my name in this building without qualification or explanation. "I'm Dr. Irene Yolette, Chief of Trauma Surgery. And I have evidence of multiple felonies committed by the woman on the floor. Evidence that my husband and aunt are currently bringing to this room. Evidence that..." "Dr. Yolette," the officer interrupted, and something in his tone stopped me. Not hostility. Not accusation. Urgency. "We're not here about her. We're here about you. About a patient who died on your service 3 days ago. A surgical complication. A family that's filed a complaint." And, he paused, glanced at his partner, something passing between them that I couldn't read. "And about a second complaint. Filed this morning. By your sister. Alleging that you accessed her medical records without authorization. That you threatened her in this hospital. That you're not fit to practice medicine." I felt the floor shift. Not physically. Just the internal vertigo of understanding that Monica's backup plan was already in motion. That she'd filed the complaint before she ever entered this room. That she'd known the safe might be found, known the confession might be exposed, known that the best defense was always a preemptive attack. "That's not..." I started, but the officer held up a hand. "We're not arresting you, Dr. Yolette. Not yet. But we need you to come with us. To answer questions. To provide your side of the story." He glanced at my father, at the monitors, at the medical context that complicated everything. "And we need you to surrender your hospital credentials. Temporarily. Pending investigation." Surrender. The same word from the confession. The same surrender of licenses, certifications, the professional identity I'd built from nothing while Monica told everyone I'd failed. I looked at my father. His eyes were closed again, but his hand tightened on mine, the first pressure he'd ever applied in my direction, the first grip that felt like support rather than demand. I looked at Monica. She was standing now, slowly, carefully, brushing herself off, finding her performance again, her eyes already bright with the tears she'd learned to summon on command. And I understood that this was the turn. The moment in every story where the protagonist loses everything before she can win. Where the evidence she'd gathered became the weapon used against her. Where the truth she'd finally spoken became the crime she was accused of. But I also understood something else. Something that Monica, for all her preparation, had never learned. The truth didn't need to be believed to be true. It just needed to be told. Again and again, by everyone who knew it, until the weight of repetition became impossible to deny. I handed my badge to the officer. The plastic was warm from my pocket, heavy with 5 years of work, 10 years of training, a lifetime of becoming someone my family had never believed I could be. "I'll come with you," I said, and my voice was steady, 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 the only thing in the room that was. "But first, I need to make a call. To my lawyer. To my husband. To the 47 people who received documentation this morning of crimes that go far beyond anything I'm accused of." I looked at Monica, let her see that I wasn't broken, wasn't beaten, wasn't performing. "And Monica? The safe is open now. The files are coming. And no amount of complaints, no amount of tears, no amount of carefully manufactured victimhood is going to close it again." The officer nodded, stepped back to give me space. I pulled out my phone, found Nathan's number, pressed call. It rang once. Twice. And then Ruth's voice, breathless, background noise of running feet and elevator bells. "Irene. Don't come down. Don't, there's someone else here. In the basement. Someone who shouldn't be. Someone who." The line went dead. I looked at the door. At the corridor. At the space between where I stood and where the truth was still unfolding, still revealing layers I'd never imagined, still becoming something larger than Monica's lies or my survival or the family we'd both lost in the fighting. And I understood, with the clarity that only comes in the middle of chaos, that Chapter 3 wasn't going to be about revenge anymore. It was going to be about rescue. About the person in the basement who shouldn't be there. About the file Ruth had found that wasn't about me, or Dad, or any of the enemies Monica had catalogued. About the secret that was still hidden, still waiting, still capable of changing everything I thought I knew about why my sister had spent 35 years building a fortress of lies to protect a position that had never actually been threatened. Because the real threat wasn't me. It had never been me. And the person in the basement was about to prove it. I moved toward the door. The officers didn't stop me. Maybe they saw something in my face that matched the urgency in Ruth's voice. Maybe they understood that the story was bigger than the complaint, bigger than the credentials, bigger than the room we'd all been trapped in. Monica called my name as I passed her. Not Irene. Not the poison nickname. Just my name, full and final, spoken with something that might have been recognition. Might have been regret. Might have been the first true thing she'd said since we were children sharing a room she couldn't bear to share. "I didn't know she'd be there," Monica whispered, and her voice was so small, so stripped, that I almost stopped. Almost turned. Almost asked who she meant, what she was confessing now, what final secret the safe had held that even Ruth hadn't found yet. But I didn't stop. I didn't turn. I just kept moving, through the door, down the corridor, toward the elevator that would take me to the basement, to Ruth, to the person who shouldn't be there, to the truth that was still waiting to be told. Because that's what Chapter 3 was for. Not for endings. Not for resolution. For the reveal that changes everything. And I was ready to hear it. I moved through the hospital corridors with the officers behind me, their footsteps heavier than mine, their radios crackling with codes I didn't need to interpret. The elevator to the basement was at the end of a service corridor, past the loading dock where ambulances brought in the broken bodies that paid for my salary, my house, my name on the door upstairs. I badged through the security door with a swipe that still worked, still opened, still let me into places that my sister's complaint hadn't yet locked. The basement smelled of concrete and old linen, the particular damp of underground spaces that never saw sun. Ruth stood 20 feet down the hallway, her back pressed against a wall of metal shelving, her hands empty, her eyes fixed on a door that stood slightly open at the corridor's end. Light spilled from the gap, yellow and flickering, the kind of light that came from a single bulb hung by someone who didn't expect to stay long. "Irene," Ruth whispered as I approached, the whispering was unnecessary. The officers had stopped at the security door, speaking into their radios, giving me space that I hadn't asked for and didn't trust. "There's someone in there." I heard movement. I called out Anne. She stopped, her throat working, her age showing in a way that the upstairs corridors hadn't allowed. And someone answered. A woman's voice. She said my name. I moved past Ruth without touching her, without reassuring her, without the gestures that normal people used in abnormal moments. My hand found the door edge, pulled it wider, stepped through into a room that shouldn't have existed. A room that wasn't on any hospital blueprint I'd ever reviewed. A room that Monica had built or found or claimed, the way she'd claimed everything else that mattered in our family's geography. The space was narrow, concrete, a storage closet converted into something else. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall, the kind with combination locks that Monica had always preferred. A folding table held a laptop, open, glowing, its screen showing a live feed of the hospital lobby where I'd stood an hour ago. Multiple feeds, I realized, cameras I hadn't noticed, angles I hadn't suspected. She'd been watching the building for years. Watching me. And in the corner, on a plastic chair that matched the ones in my father's cardiac room, sat a woman I didn't recognize. She was 60, maybe 65, her hair gray and unstyled, her clothes simple, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who'd learned to wait. She looked up when I entered, and her eyes, green, flecked with brown, the exact shade of my mother's, found mine with an intensity that stopped my breathing. "You're Irene," she said. Not a question. A confirmation. Her voice was rough and used, the voice of someone who didn't speak often or easily. "You look like her. The younger one. The one she kept." I stood in the doorway, the officers' voices distant behind me, Ruth's breathing audible at my shoulder. "Who are you?" The woman smiled, small and sad and nothing like Monica's performances. "I'm the original," she said. "The first Monica. The one who came 3 years before your sister and was sent away before anyone could compare us." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a photograph, held it toward me without standing. A Polaroid, faded, the colors bleeding at the edges. A baby in a hospital blanket. A woman's hand holding the card beside it, the date visible, the name written in my mother's careful script, Monica and Willette. Born March 14, 1987. March 14. The same birthday. The same name. The same everything except the year. "Your mother couldn't have children after me," the woman continued, her fingers tracing the photograph's edge. "Complications. Infections. She told everyone I died. Stillborn. A tragedy. Then she adopted your sister 3 years later and gave her my name. My birthday. My place in the family tree." She looked up at me, and her eyes were dry, the tears already spent decades ago. She couldn't bear to let me exist and she couldn't bear to let the name disappear. So she built a replacement. A better version. One that would never know she wasn't the original. I took the photograph. The paper was thin, fragile, the kind of evidence that could be dismissed as forgery, as fantasy, as the delusion of a woman who'd spent 35 years in institutions and halfway houses and the margins of a family that had erased her twice. But I knew my mother's handwriting. I knew the way she formed her A's, the way she dotted her I's, the particular curve of her W that she'd taught me at the kitchen table in Hartford before I'd learned that lessons from her always came with conditions. "Why are you here?" I asked, though the question was wrong, too small for the space between us. "Because your sister found me," the woman said, and her hand stilled in her lap, the waiting posture of someone who'd finally reached the end of a journey she'd never chosen. 2 years ago. She hired the same investigator who followed you. She learned the truth about her own origin. About the adoption that wasn't legal, the birth certificate that was forged, the woman who was still alive and still had a claim to the name she'd built her entire identity on. The woman paused, her eyes moving to the laptop screen, to the feeds that showed my sister in my father's room, performing grief for the officers who'd returned to question her. She brought me here. To this room. To keep me close and keep me hidden. To control the one secret that could destroy everything she'd built. I understood then. The safe in my mother's basement. The files on every family member. The surveillance and the sabotage and the relentless, grinding need to eliminate anyone who might threaten her position. Monica hadn't been protecting herself from me. She'd been protecting herself from this. From the woman in the plastic chair who held the original birth certificate, the original name, the original claim to everything my sister had stolen and performed and killed to keep. She was going to use me, the woman said, her voice dropping to a whisper that matched Ruth's, that matched the basement's damp concrete. The confession she prepared for you? The one that would make you surrender your credentials, your career, your right to exist in her world? She had a second version. For me. To sign away my identity. My history. My legal claim to being Monica and Willette. She reached into her other pocket, pulled out a document that matched the one in my scrub pocket, cream cardstock, embossed lettering, the same clause at the end about surrender and silence and perpetual absence. She was going to make me disappear again. Officially. Legally. Forever. And then she was going to kill me. I heard her on the phone. Last week. Arranging the overdose. The accident. The whatever that would close the loop. I looked at the document in her hand. At the photograph in mine. At the laptop screen where Monica was still performing, still calculating, still unaware that the room she'd built to control her original was now the room that would expose her as the copy. Ruth moved into the doorway behind me, her shadow falling across the concrete floor. The police, she said, her voice steady now, the shock processed into action. They're coming down. They followed you. We need to. No, I said, and the word was final, the voice I used in the operating room when a resident was about to make a mistake that couldn't be undone. We don't need to run. We don't need to hide. We need to let them see. I turned to the officers who were entering the corridor, their flashlights sweeping the concrete, their voices calling out protocols and positions. Officers. This room. These documents. This woman. She has evidence of fraud, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and 35 years of identity theft perpetrated by the woman who filed the complaint against me upstairs. The first officer stopped at the door, his flashlight finding the woman in the chair, the cabinets, the laptop with its live feeds. His partner moved past him, hand on his belt, eyes scanning for threat. But the threat wasn't in this room. The threat had never been in this room. Dr. Willette, the first officer said, and his voice had changed, the neutrality cracking to show the human beneath. We need to. Call your supervisor, I said, handing him the photograph, the birth certificate, the confession meant for the woman who should have been my sister. Call the district attorney. Call whoever needs to see this. But first, arrest Monica Willette. Not for what she did to me. For what she did to her. For what she was planning to do to my father. For the 35 years of fraud that started with a stolen name and ends with attempted murder. The officer took the documents. His partner moved to the laptop, began documenting the feeds, the cameras, the surveillance network that Monica had built to watch a world she could never fully trust. Ruth stepped into the room, found a second plastic chair, sat down beside the woman who shared her niece's name and none of her niece's crimes. What's your real name? Ruth asked, her hand finding the woman's shoulder, the first touch she'd offered since entering the basement. The woman looked at Ruth, then at me, then at the photograph that the officer was sealing into an evidence bag. And, she said. Just Anne. They took the Monica when they took everything else. I never used it again. Not even in my head. She paused, her fingers finding Ruth's on her shoulder, the tentative connection of two women who'd both been erased by the same family, the same silence, the same refusal to let inconvenient truths exist. But I'd like it back now. If that's possible. If the law allows. I moved to the laptop, closed the feed of my father's room, opened the file directory that Monica had organized with the same care she'd used for everything. Folders labeled with names. Dates. Crimes. Evidence of her surveillance of me, of Nathan, of Ruth, of the colleagues she'd sabotaged and the friends she'd turned and the life she'd built on a foundation of stolen identity and manufactured enemies. And one folder, unlabeled, hidden 3 layers deep, that contained the adoption records. The forged birth certificate. The payments to the investigator who'd found N. The wire transfers to the medical billing company that had accessed my files. The complete architecture of a deception that had lasted longer than I'd been alive. I copied everything to a thumb drive I found in the desk drawer. I sealed the laptop with the officer's evidence tape. I stepped back into the corridor and let the professionals do their work, the way I'd always let them do their work, the way I'd learned that some things couldn't be fixed by individual action, only by systems, only by process, only by the slow grinding of institutions that didn't care about family or performance or the stories we told to protect ourselves from truth. The elevator ride upstairs took 30 seconds. I spent them looking at my reflection in the metal doors, the same face I'd seen in scrub room mirrors, in car windows, in the stainless steel of surgical equipment that reflected back a woman I'd built without help, without permission, without the name or the birthday or the family that should have been mine by right of blood. The doors opened on the 2nd floor. I walked to my father's room, past the nurses who looked up from their stations, past the residents who stepped aside, past the colleagues who'd heard rumors and were waiting for confirmation, for drama, for the resolution of a story that had become public in ways I hadn't chosen and couldn't control. Monica was still in the room. The officers who'd followed me downstairs had left her with a partner, a young woman in a Hartford PD uniform who looked bored, who looked young enough to be impressed by my sister's tears, who looked like she hadn't yet learned that performance was always cheaper than truth. Irene, Monica said when I entered, her voice breaking on my name, the old weapon failing to fire. Irene, please. They're saying things. They're saying They're saying you're not who you claim to be, I said, moving to the bedside opposite her, placing myself between her and our father, who was awake now, his eyes open, his monitor showing a heart rate that climbed with every word. They're saying your name is stolen. Your birthday is stolen. Your entire identity is a legal fiction built on a child who didn't die, who was hidden, who you planned to kill to protect the lie. Monica's face went blank. Not white. Not pale. Blank. The mask slipping completely, showing nothing underneath, the void that existed where a real person should have been. She'd spent so long performing that she'd forgotten what truth looked like. Or maybe she'd never known. That's not, she started, but her voice failed, the script empty, the machinery of her mind grinding against facts that couldn't be spun, couldn't be reframed, couldn't be turned into another version of the story where she was the victim and I was the villain. And is in the basement, I said, and the name landed like a physical blow, Monica's body actually flinching, her hand finding the bed rail for support. And is talking to the police. And has the original birth certificate. And has the confession you prepared for her, the same one you prepared for me, the same clause about surrendering everything, disappearing forever, letting you keep what you stole. I leaned closer, close enough to smell her fear, the sour adrenaline that no perfume could mask. And has the recording of your phone call. The one where you arranged her death. The overdose. The accident. The whatever that would close the loop. Monica looked at our father. He looked back at her, his eyes dry, his face set, the expression of a man who'd spent 35 years believing in a daughter who had never existed. Monica, he said, and the name sounded strange in his mouth now, foreign, the word for something that had been lost and found to be counterfeit. Is it true? Are you? I'm your daughter, Monica said, the old reflex, the old claim, the old performance that had always worked before. Dad, I'm your daughter. I raised you. I stayed. I was the one who. You were the one who lied, I said, not raising my voice, not needing to, the quiet certainty of facts that didn't require volume. You were the one who erased me. Who erased Anne? Who built a fortress of documents and surveillance and manufactured confessions to protect a position that was never yours to claim? I stepped back from the bed, let the distance between us become permanent, become legal, become the space where two women who'd shared a name and a family and nothing else could finally acknowledge what they'd been to each other. And now you're going to face the consequences. Not from me. From the law. From the family you manipulated. From the woman in the basement who wants her name back. The officer moved forward, her hand on Monica's arm, the gesture gentle but firm, the beginning of a process that would end in handcuffs, in charges, in a trial where the evidence I'd gathered, the evidence Nathan had sent, the evidence and had preserved would finally tell a story that couldn't be revised. Monica didn't resist. She didn't scream. She didn't perform. She just looked at me, her eyes empty, her mouth slightly open, the expression of someone who'd finally reached the end of a script that had run for 35 years and found no more lines to speak. I just wanted, she whispered, but the sentence had no ending, no object, no truth to complete it. She wanted. That was the whole story. The wanting that had driven every lie, every erasure, every carefully constructed destruction of anyone who might compete for the attention she'd been trained to believe was her birthright. The officer let her out. I didn't watch her go. I turned to my father, who was crying now, the silent tears of a man who'd built his life on one daughter's stories and was only now seeing how the other daughter had survived without them. But I didn't move to comfort him. I didn't take his hand. I didn't offer the forgiveness that he hadn't asked for and that I hadn't decided I could afford. I need to check on Anne, I said, clinical, distant, the voice I used for patients I was still learning to care about. And then I need to talk to the district attorney. And then I need to decide whether to press charges for the fraud, the conspiracy, the professional sabotage that your chosen daughter attempted against me. I paused, let the silence hold, let him feel the weight of what he'd allowed, what he'd enabled, what he'd chosen not to see. But first, Dad, I need you to understand something. And as your daughter. Biologically. Legally. The child you thought died. The child you let your wife tell you was gone. The child who spent 35 years in institutions and shelters and the margins of a family that erased her to make room for a replacement. I leaned closer, let him see my face, let him finally see me. And I am your daughter. The one you threw away. The one who built a life without you. The one who is standing here now because I chose to become something you never believed I could be. I straightened, stepped back, let the doctor-patient distance reassert itself. You have 2 daughters left. Not one. Never one. And what you do with that knowledge, that's your choice. Not mine. Not Monica's. Yours. I left the room without looking back. The officers in the corridor stepped aside. The nurses at their stations looked down, suddenly busy, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something that would become hospital legend, family myth, the story that would replace all the stories that had come before. The basement was quiet when I returned. And sat in her plastic chair, Ruth beside her, the 2 women holding hands with the tentative connection of strangers who'd discovered they were family. The officers had sealed the cabinets, documented the laptop, begun the process that would turn this room into evidence, into record, into the official version of a truth that had been hidden for longer than any of us had been alive. Irene, and said, looking up, her eyes still dry, still spent, still holding the calm of someone who'd already survived the worst that could be done to her. They said I can keep the name. If I want. Monica and Willette. The original. The one who was supposed to die and didn't. I crouched beside her, close enough to see the pores of her skin, the lines around her eyes that matched mine, that matched our mothers, that matched the family we'd both been denied. Do you want it? I asked. The name? The family? The history that comes with it? And looked at Ruth, then at the officers, then at the concrete walls that had held her for 2 years while Monica decided how to dispose of the original that threatened the copy. "I want the truth," she said. "The name is just a word. The family is just blood. But the truth," she paused, her fingers finding mine, cold and thin and stronger than they looked. "The truth is mine. Finally. After 35 years of being told I didn't exist, I finally have proof that I do." I stood up. The officers were packing their equipment, sealing their bags, preparing to leave with the evidence that would build a case, that would change lives, that would finally tell a story that couldn't be revised or retracted or reinterpreted. Ruth stood too, her hand on Anne's shoulder, her eyes finding mine with the weight of everything we'd both witnessed, everything we'd both survived, everything we'd both chosen to become. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his face calm, his lawyer's mask in place, but his hands steady now, the shaking gone, the anger processed into action. "The district attorney is upstairs," he said. "She wants to talk to all of us." "Anne." "Ruth." "You." He paused, his eyes moving to the sealed cabinets, the documented laptop, the room that would become Exhibit A in a trial that would reshape everything our family had been. "And she wants to talk to your father. He's agreed to testify. Against Monica. For Anne. For the truth." I nodded. Not surprised. Not relieved. Just acknowledging the turn, the shift, the moment in every story where the protagonist realizes that the victory she'd imagined isn't the victory she's achieved. I'd wanted revenge. I'd wanted my sister exposed, my parents sorry, my position restored. But what I had instead was more complicated. A family expanded rather than repaired. A truth told rather than believed. A choice that wasn't mine to make, about forgiveness, about reconciliation, about whether the door I'd controlled would ever open wide enough to let them through. And stood up, slowly, carefully, her body unaccustomed to movement after 2 years in the basement, 2 years of waiting, 2 years of knowing that her death was being arranged by the woman who wore her name. She leaned on Ruth, then on me, then found her own balance, her own feet, her own ability to stand without support. "I'd like to meet him," Anne said, her voice stronger now, the unused muscle finding its function. "Our father. Before I talk to the district attorney. Before I become evidence instead of a person." She looked at me, her green eyes flecked with brown, the exact shade of our mother's, the exact shade that Monica had worn like a costume. "Will you come with me?" I thought of my father's room upstairs. The monitors. The tears. The choice that was his and not mine. I thought of the 35 years of absence, the 5 years of silence, the lifetime of being the daughter who wasn't chosen, wasn't seen, wasn't worth the effort of questioning the story that excluded her. "Yes," I said, and the word was simple, true, the first time I'd claimed my place in this expanded family without qualification or explanation. "I'll come with you." "But Anne?" She paused at the door, her hand on the frame, her body silhouetted against the corridor light. "He's not ready," I said. "He may never be ready. And you don't owe him your forgiveness, your patience, your presence. You don't owe him anything. The only thing you owe is to yourself. To the truth. To the life you're going to build now that you finally exist in the record." And smiled, small and sad and nothing like Monica's performances. "I know," she said. "I've known since I was 6 years old and my foster mother told me my real name was a lie. Since I was 16 and found the birth certificate in a file that shouldn't have been open. Since I was 30 and the investigator showed up, and I thought finally someone was going to acknowledge that I was real." She stepped into the corridor, her hand finding mine, her grip stronger than it looked. "But knowing and being known are different things, Irene. You know that better than anyone. And right now, for the first time in 35 years, I have the chance to be known. By my father. By my sister. By the law and the world and the family that tried to erase me." She squeezed my fingers, hard, the pressure of someone who'd learned to hold on through decades of being told to let go. "I'm not going to waste that chance. Not for revenge. Not for justice. Just for the simple, brutal fact of existing where I was supposed to be dead. We walked upstairs together, and Ruth and Nathan and me, the officers behind us, the evidence bag swinging, the machinery of legal process beginning to grind. The district attorney met us in a conference room, a woman my age with sharp eyes and a sharper suit, who listened to Anne's story without interrupting, who reviewed the documents without reacting, who closed her file with a snap that signaled the beginning of the end. "She'll be charged," the district attorney said, her voice neutral, trained, giving nothing away. Fraud. Identity theft. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted murder. The evidence is sufficient. The witnesses are credible. The case is strong. She looked at me, then at Anne, then at the photograph that had started everything, the faded Polaroid of a baby who should have died and didn't. "But I need you both to understand something. A trial will take years. The defense will attack your credibility, your history, your motives. They will argue that Anne is unstable, that you are vindictive, that this is a family dispute rather than a criminal case." She paused, let the silence hold, let us feel the weight of what we were choosing. "Are you prepared for that? For the public exposure? For the continued contact with a family that has already cost you so much?" And answered first, her voice steady, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who'd learned to wait. "I'm prepared to exist," she said. "Publicly. Legally. Permanently. Whatever that costs." I answered second, my voice matching hers, the calm that came from having already survived the worst that could be done to me. "I'm prepared to testify," I said. "To document. To support whatever prosecution the evidence supports. But I'm not prepared to be defined by this anymore. By her. By the story she built and I survived." I looked at Nathan, who nodded, the small gesture that held everything we didn't need to speak. "After the trial, I'm leaving Hartford. Returning to my work. My life. The family I've chosen rather than inherited." The district attorney nodded, made notes, closed her file again. "Then we proceed," she said. "Tomorrow. The arraignment. The press release. The beginning of the public phase." She stood, shook our hands, left the room with the brisk efficiency of someone who had many cases, many victims, many stories that needed to become records. We sat in silence after she left. And Ruth and Nathan and me, four people who'd been connected by crime and survival and the accidental geography of a family that had tried to erase two of us and failed. The window showed afternoon light, the particular gold of Connecticut in late summer, the season that had held my medical school acceptance, my sister's first performance, my father's last moment of pride. "Irene," Anne said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant, the voice of someone who wasn't used to being heard. "The confession. The one she prepared for me. It had a clause. About surrendering my identity, my history, my legal claim to the name." She paused, her fingers finding mine again, the cold thin grip that had become familiar in the space of an hour. "But it also had a second clause. About you. About your medical license. Your career. Your future." She looked at me, her green eyes direct, unflinching, the exact shade of our mother's but without the evasion, without the careful blankness that had allowed so much harm. "She was going to use my signature to destroy you. To make it look like the original Monica, the real Monica, was the one who'd sabotaged your career. To frame a dead woman for a living crime." I felt the floor shift. Not physically. The internal vertigo of understanding that Monica's plan had been deeper, darker, more complete than I'd imagined. That she'd prepared not just to eliminate Anne, but to use that elimination as a weapon against me. To create a scapegoat who couldn't defend herself, who'd been officially dead for 35 years, who'd take the blame for everything while Monica continued to wear her name and her position and her carefully constructed innocence. She was going to kill two originals with one forgery, I said, my voice flat, emptied out by the image of the document, the signature, the legal machinery that would have turned Anne's death into my destruction. And would disappear, officially this time, with a signed confession to crimes she'd never committed. And I would lose everything, officially this time, with a legal record that showed the original Monica had destroyed me out of jealousy, out of madness, out of the instability that comes from being erased. Nathan stood up, moved to the window, his back to us, his shoulders rigid with the anger he'd held for so long. "We need to add this to the complaint," he said, his voice controlled, the lawyer's precision that had made him successful, that had made him mine. "The attempted murder. The frame. The complete architecture of destruction. We need to make sure the prosecution understands that this wasn't just identity theft. This was systematic elimination. Of Anne. Of you. Of anyone who threatened the fiction." I nodded, though he couldn't see me, though the gesture was for myself, for the acknowledgement that the story was finally complete, finally understood, finally ready to be told in a way that couldn't be revised or retracted or reinterpreted. "We'll add it," I said. "Tomorrow. With the district attorney. With the evidence. With Anne's testimony and the documents and the recording of the phone call." I paused, let the silence hold, let the room absorb the weight of what we were planning, what we were beginning, what we were finally choosing to become. But tonight, we rest. We eat. We exist in the simple, brutal fact of being alive and known and finally real. Ruth drove us to my house, the suburban colonial with the porch that got good morning light, the kitchen where Nathan made coffee, the bedroom where I'd cried and planned and rebuilt myself into someone my family wouldn't recognize. And walked through the rooms with the tentative steps of a visitor, touching the furniture, examining the photographs, finding herself in the wedding picture where Ruth cried enough for 2 parents, in the residency graduation where Aunt Ruth was the only family in the frame. "She's here," Anne said, pointing to a corner of the wedding photograph, a blur of movement, a figure half out of frame. "The investigator. The one who followed you. Monica sent him to document your happiness. To prove that you didn't deserve it. To find evidence that you were fraud, that your success was stolen, that your marriage was a performance like hers." I looked at the blur. The brown coat. The back pew of Sarah's funeral. The same man, following me for years, documenting my life for my sister's files, never finding what Monica needed because what I had was real, was earned, was built without her permission and beyond her reach. "He's in the complaint now," Nathan said from the kitchen doorway, coffee mug in hand, his voice calm, his eyes finding mine with the steady warmth that had made me choose him, trust him, build a life with him that no one could destroy. "The investigator. The billing company. Everyone who participated in the surveillance, the fraud, the conspiracy. They're all named. They're all exposed. They're all going to face the same choice Monica faces. Between confession and consequence." And sat down on the couch, her body folding into the cushions with the exhaustion of someone who'd been standing for 35 years. Ruth sat beside her, her hand finding Anne's, the connection that had formed in the basement becoming permanent, becoming family, becoming the bond that Monica had tried to prevent by hiding the original, erasing the copy, destroying anyone who knew the difference. I stood in the doorway, watching them, watching my husband, watching the life that had been mine alone for 5 years and was now expanding to include the sister I'd never known, the aunt who'd always chosen me, the truth that had finally become too heavy to hide. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother, the first in 5 years, the first since the blocked numbers and returned letters and the careful silence that had allowed everything to happen. The message was short. Unadorned. Devoid of the performance that Monica had always supplied. "Your father wants to see you. Both of you. And you. Tomorrow. Before the arraignment. He says he has something to give you. Something that should have been yours years ago." I read it twice. 3 times. The words simple, direct, the voice of a woman who'd spent 35 years performing motherhood and was only now learning to practice it. I didn't answer. Not yet. The choice was mine, the door was mine, the control that Monica had tried to steal was finally, completely, permanently mine. But I would go. Tomorrow. With Anne. To hear what our father had to say, to receive what he had to give, to decide whether the family that had erased us could ever be trusted to know us. Not for forgiveness. Not for reconciliation. Just for the simple, brutal fact of existing where we had been supposed to be dead. The arraignment was held in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and old paper, the particular scent of institutions that processed human conflict into legal record. Monica sat at the defense table, her hair pulled back, her face bare of makeup, wearing the simple clothes that her lawyer had probably chosen to suggest humility, vulnerability, the performance of a woman who'd lost everything and was asking for mercy she had never shown. And I sat in the front row, behind the prosecution, our shoulders touching, our hands folded in our laps with the stillness of women who had learned to wait. Ruth sat behind us. Nathan beside her. My father in the back corner, alone, his face gray, his hands shaking, the man who'd chosen wrong for 35 years and was only now beginning to understand the cost. The charges were read. Fraud. Identity theft. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted murder. The list was long, the evidence substantial, the case strong. Monica's lawyer argued for bail, for release, for the presumption of innocence that was her legal right and our lived contradiction. The judge denied bail. The gavel fell. The officers moved to escort Monica out, and for one moment, one fraction of a second, her eyes found mine across the courtroom, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Not calculation. Not performance. Not the machinery of her mind grinding toward the next lie. Just emptiness. The void that existed where a real person should have been, the space that 35 years of stolen identity had carved out, the nothing that remained when the story finally ended. She looked away first. The officers let her out. The courtroom emptied, the journalists rushing to file their stories, the lawyers packing their briefs, the family members who'd come to witness the destruction of a woman they'd believed in, trusted, loved without questioning why she needed so desperately to be believed. My father approached us in the corridor. He moved slowly, carefully, the gait of a man whose heart had been damaged by stress and whose conscience had been damaged longer. He carried a folder, manila, unlabeled, the kind that held nothing important until you opened it and discovered it held everything. Irene, he said, and my name in his mouth was still strange, still uncertain, still learning to be real. Anne. He looked at my sister, the original, the one he'd been told was dead, and his face crumpled, not dramatically, just a slow collapse of features too tired to maintain the mask anymore. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Your mother told me. She said, you were gone. Before I could hold you. Before I could. I know, and said, and her voice was gentle, the forgiveness that I hadn't found yet, the grace that came from having survived the worst and emerged with something other than anger. I know you didn't know. And I know that not knowing was a choice. That believing her was easier. That loving the replacement was simpler than mourning the original. She paused, her hand finding his, the tentative connection of a daughter who'd never been held and a father who'd never learned to hold. But I'm here now. I'm real now. And what you do with that, whether you learn to know me, whether you can bear to look at the face that reminds you of what you lost, that's your choice. Not mine. Not anymore. My father nodded, small and devastated and finally honest. He handed me the folder. I opened it. The first page was a birth certificate. The real one. Anne's. Dated March 14, 1987. Signed by the doctor who'd delivered her, who'd pronounced her dead, who'd been paid to falsify the record and keep the secret. The second page was a letter. Handwritten. My mother's careful script. Dated 3 weeks ago. Before the reunion invitation. Before the bill. Before the collapse in the lobby and the discovery in the basement and the arraignment that had ended the performance forever. I knew, the letter read. From the beginning. From the moment the doctor handed me the living child and told me she was dead. I knew. I chose. I built the lie because I couldn't bear the truth. Because I wanted a daughter I could control, could name, could replace if she failed me. Because the original was too real, too demanding, too much like me. And because your father loved her too much, too immediately, too completely, in a way he never loved me. I read it twice. 3 times. The words simple, direct, the confession of a woman who'd spent 35 years performing motherhood and was only now, too late, learning to practice honesty. Where is she? I asked, looking up from the letter, finding my father's eyes, the gray desperation that matched my own. Mom. Where is she? My father shook his head. Gone, he said, the word flat, final, the end of a story that had started with a lie and continued with replacements and ended with the original truth finally exposed. She left last night. After the police came. After she learned about Anne, about the basement, about the confession Monica had prepared. She packed a bag. Wrote the letter. Told me to give it to you. To both of you. He paused, his hand finding mine, the pressure weak, tentative, the grip of a man who was learning to touch after decades of holding back. She said she couldn't face what she'd done. Couldn't bear to see the daughters she'd erased. Couldn't live in the truth she'd spent her life avoiding. I folded the letter. Slipped it back into the folder. Handed the folder to Anne, who took it with the care she used for everything, the gentleness of someone who'd learned to handle fragile things because she'd been treated as fragile for so long. She's not dead, I said, my voice flat, factual, the diagnosis of a condition that had been terminal from birth. She's just gone. The same way she was always gone. The same way she let me be gone. The same way she let and be gone for 35 years while she built a family of performances and replacements and carefully constructed absences. My father nodded, small and broken and finally understanding that the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd defended, the woman he'd allowed to shape his entire family had been the architect of everything that had destroyed it. And closed the folder. Looked at me. Looked at our father. Looked at the corridor where the officers had led Monica away, where the journalists were still gathering, where the story was becoming public record, becoming history, becoming the truth that would outlast all of us. What now? And asked, and the question was simple, direct, the voice of someone who'd never been allowed to ask what came next, who'd spent 35 years in waiting rooms and institutions and the margins of a family that had erased her. I looked at Nathan, who stood in the corridor doorway, his face calm, his hand steady, his presence the constant that had made everything else possible. I looked at Ruth, who was crying silently, the tears that had always been hers to shed, the grief that had always been hers to carry. I looked at my father, gray and shaking and finally seeing. Now, I said, my voice steady, the voice I'd found in operating rooms and lost in family kitchens and reclaimed in the basement where the original Monica had waited for death and found instead the sister who should have been hers from the beginning. Now we live. We work. We build the lives that were supposed to be ours. We let the law do what the law does. We let the story become what it becomes. And we choose, every day, whether to open the door that Monica tried to close, whether to let in the family that erased us, whether to become something other than what they made us. And smiled, small and sad and real. And Monica, she asked, the name strange in her mouth, the name that should have been hers, that had been stolen and worn and finally destroyed by the woman who'd never been entitled to it. Monica is gone, I said, and the word was final, the end of a performance that had lasted 35 years and cost everything it touched. Not dead. Just gone. Into the system. Into the record. Into the truth that she spent her life trying to escape. I paused, let the silence hold, let the corridor absorb the weight of what we were ending, what we were beginning, what we were finally choosing to become. And the name? The birthday? The identity that she stole? And looked at the folder in her hands. At the birth certificate that proved she was real, that she had always been real, that the lie of her death was finally, completely, permanently exposed. "I don't want it," she said, and her voice was steady, certain, the voice of someone who'd spent 35 years being defined by a name and was now free to choose her own. The name. The birthday. The history that comes with it. "I want something new. Something mine. Something that no one gave me and no one can take away." She looked at me, her green eyes direct, unflinching, the exact shade of our mother's but without the evasion, without the careful blankness that had allowed so much harm. "And Willette." Just that. No middle name. No borrowed identity. Just the truth of who I am, finally, after 35 years of being told I didn't exist. I nodded. Not surprised. Not relieved. Just acknowledging the choice, the freedom, the simple brutal fact of existing where we had been supposed to be dead. We walked out of the courthouse together, and Ruth and Nathan and me, into the afternoon light that was the particular gold of Connecticut in late summer. My father followed, slowly, carefully, the gait of a man who was learning to walk without the support of the lies he'd carried for decades. At the bottom of the steps, a woman waited. Short gray hair, sharp eyes, a suit that matched the district attorney's but wasn't official. She held a folder of her own, manila, unlabeled, the kind that held nothing important until you opened it. "Dr. Willette," she said, her voice neutral, trained, giving nothing away. "I'm from the medical board. We've reviewed the complaint filed against you. The allegation of unauthorized record access. The threat to a family member. The unfitness to practice." She paused, her eyes moving to Anne, to Ruth, to my father in the background, to the family that was still forming, still choosing, still becoming what it would be. "The complaint has been withdrawn. By the complainant. This morning. Before the arraignment." I stared at her. The complaint withdrawn. The threat lifted. The career that Monica had tried to destroy, that she'd planned to frame and for destroying, was suddenly, completely, permanently safe. "Why?" I asked, though I knew, though the answer was in the folder she held, in the morning's events, in the final calculation of a woman who'd understood that the performance was over and the only mercy available was the mercy she showed herself. The woman from the medical board opened her folder, pulled out a single page, handed it to me. A handwritten note. Monica's script, the careful flourish that matched the reunion invitation, the bill, the confession that had never been signed. "I can't win," it read. "I know that now. I knew it in the courtroom when she looked at me and saw nothing. Not anger. Not revenge. Just the empty space where I used to be. Where I never really was. I withdraw the complaint. I surrender the name. I accept the consequences. And I ask, not for forgiveness, but for the simple brutal fact of being forgotten. Of becoming what I always feared. Nothing. No one. The space between the original and the replacement, finally empty of both." I folded the note. Handed it back. The woman from the medical board closed her folder, nodded once, walked away down the courthouse steps without looking back. And touched my arm, her fingers cold, thin, stronger than they looked. "What does it mean?" she asked. I looked at the sky, at the gold light, at the future that was opening in front of us, unexpected, unplanned, uncontrolled by anyone but ourselves. "It means she's finally telling the truth," I said. "The only truth she has left. That she doesn't exist. That she never did. That the space she occupied was always borrowed, always stolen, always waiting for the original to claim it or for both of us to finally let it go." We walked to the car, Nathan's sedan, the vehicle that had carried us through 5 years of marriage, through the basement discovery, through the arraignment and the aftermath. Ruth and in the back seat. My father following in his own car, the distance that would always exist between us, the space that might narrow with time or might not, that was his choice and not mine. Nathan drove. I sat in the passenger seat, my hand finding his on the gear shift, the touch that had become language between us, that said everything we didn't need to speak. Where? He asked, his voice quiet, the question that had no single answer, that opened into the future we were building moment by moment. Home, I said, and the word was simple, true, the first time I'd claimed a place without qualification or explanation. Our home. The house with the porch and the kitchen and the bedroom where we built a life that no one could destroy. Where Anne can stay until she finds her own. Where Ruth can visit whenever she chooses. Where the door opens only when I decide, only as wide as I want, only for the people who show up without performance, without condition, without the need to control the story. Nathan nodded. Drove. The suburbs gave way to the streets I knew, the turns I'd made 1,000 times, the house that waited with its morning light and its coffee maker and its dog who had never once judged me for eating cereal at midnight. We pulled into the driveway. Hippocrates barked from the kitchen, the sound of welcome, of presence, of the simple brutal fact of being known. And got out of the car first, stood in the driveway, looked up at the house, the porch, the window that caught the afternoon light. It's small, she said, and her voice was wondering, the observation of someone who'd spent 35 years in institutions and basements and the margins of spaces that were never hers. It's enough, I said, moving past her to the door, unlocking it, stepping inside to the smell of coffee and dog and the life that had been mine alone and was now expanding, becoming, finally becoming what it had always been meant to be. And followed. Ruth followed. My father stayed in his car, visible through the window, sitting with his hands on the wheel, deciding whether to come in, whether to knock, whether to ask permission to enter the life he'd tried to erase and was now learning to witness. I didn't wave him in. Didn't beckon. Didn't perform the forgiveness that I hadn't found yet and might never find. I just left the door open. The width I chose. The control that Monica had tried to steal and that I had finally, completely, permanently reclaimed. And sat on the couch, her body folding into the cushions with the exhaustion of someone who'd been standing for 35 years and could finally rest. Ruth made coffee in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of a woman who'd been my only family and was now one of many. Nathan stood in the doorway, his face calm, his hands steady, his presence the constant that made everything else possible. I moved to the window. Looked out at my father's car. At the man who'd chosen wrong for decades and was only now beginning to understand that the choice had always been his, that the door had always been his to open or close, that the daughter he'd thrown away was now the daughter who controlled the threshold. He looked up. Met my eyes through the glass. Held the gaze for 5 seconds, 10, 15, the longest he'd ever looked at me in my entire life. Then he nodded. Small. Devastated. Finally honest. And he drove away. Not forever. Not permanently. Just for now. For the time it would take him to learn what honesty meant, what presence meant, what fatherhood might have been if he'd chosen differently 35 years ago. I closed the door. Not all the way. Just enough to mark the boundary, to claim the space, to remind myself that the width was mine to decide, today and every day, for the rest of the life I was building. And looked up from the couch. He's gone, she said, not asking, just observing. For now, I said. He'll be back. Or he won't. The door is open. The choice is his. That's the only truth I can offer him. The only truth I can offer any of them. Ruth brought coffee. 4 mugs, the chipped one that Nathan had bought me, the plain ones for guests, the careful distribution of a woman who'd learned to make space for everyone who chose to show up. We sat in the living room, the 4 of us, the family that had formed around truth rather than blood, around choice rather than obligation, around the simple brutal fact of surviving what should have destroyed us. My phone buzzed. A text from the district attorney, the sharp woman in the sharp suit who was building the case that would become record, become history, become the official version of a truth that had been hidden too long. The trial date is set. 6 months. Monica has agreed to plead. No contest. The sentence will be substantial. The record will be clear. And Dr. Yolette. I read the rest without reacting, without performing, without the need to frame the information for anyone else's understanding. The medical board has closed its inquiry. Your credentials are confirmed. Your position is secure. The complaint has been expunged. You are, officially and permanently, exactly what you claim to be. I set the phone down. Picked up my coffee. Looked at Anne, who was tracing the rim of her mug with a finger that had never learned to be still, that had spent 35 years waiting for contact that never came. What now? She asked again, the question that had no single answer, that opened into the future we were building moment by moment. Now, I said, my voice steady, the voice I'd found in operating rooms and lost in family kitchens and reclaimed in the truth that had finally become too heavy to hide. Now we live. We work. We become what we were supposed to be before the lies started. We let the law do what it does. We let the family become what it becomes. And we choose, every day, whether to open the door, whether to let in the people who show up without performance, without condition, without the need to control the story. Anne nodded. Ruth nodded. Nathan reached for my hand, the touch that said everything, that held everything, that was the constant in a world that had finally stopped spinning. We sat in silence. The coffee cooling. The dog snoring. The afternoon light shifting through the window, the particular gold of Connecticut in late summer, the season that had held my medical school acceptance, my sister's first performance, my father's last moment of pride, and now held something else. The beginning. The real beginning. The story that started with truth rather than lie, with choice rather than inheritance, with the simple brutal fact of existing where we had been supposed to be dead. I looked at Anne, at the green eyes flecked with brown, the exact shade of our mother's but without the evasion, without the careful blankness that had allowed so much harm. Welcome home, I said, and the words were simple, direct, the first time I'd offered the space that had been mine alone to someone who shared my blood but not my history, my name but not my story, my survival but not my journey. And smiled. Small. Sad. Real. Thank you, she said, and her voice was steady, certain, the voice of someone who'd spent 35 years being told she didn't exist and was finally, completely, permanently home. The door stayed open. The width I chose. The control that had always been mine, that Monica had tried to steal, that I had finally reclaimed. And outside, in the driveway, in the world beyond the porch that got good morning light, the truth continued its patient work. The trial would proceed. The record would grow. The story would become what it became, public and permanent and beyond anyone's power to revise. But inside, in the space I'd built, the family I'd chosen, the life I'd earned without permission and beyond reach, the only story that mattered was the one we were telling now. Moment by moment. Choice by choice. Door by door. And finished her coffee. Ruth started dinner. Nathan reviewed his briefs. Hippocrates thumped his tail against the floor, optimistic about crumbs, about presents, about the simple brutal fact of being known. I moved to the window. Looked out at the street, the neighbors, the world that had tried to erase me and had failed. And I understood, with the clarity that only comes in moments of stillness, that revenge wasn't a document or a confrontation or a moment of public humiliation. Revenge was this. The living room. The coffee mugs. The door open exactly as wide as I chose. The family that had tried to destroy me, sitting in the house I'd built without them, drinking from cups I'd bought with my own salary, breathing in the space that I'd claimed as mine and was now generous enough to share. That was the victory. Not Monica's imprisonment. Not my father's tears. Not my mother's flight or the trial or the district attorney's careful case. The victory was the ordinary moment. The choice to open the door. The choice to let them in, or not, on terms that were finally, completely, permanently mine. I turned back to the room. To Anne. To Ruth. To Nathan, who looked up from his briefs and met my eyes with the steady warmth that had made me choose him, trust him, build a life with him that no one could destroy. Tomorrow, I said, my voice steady, the voice that had carried me through 1,000 emergency rooms, 100 confrontations, the 5 years of silence that had finally ended in noise and truth and the simple brutal fact of being known. Tomorrow we start. The new names. The new documents. The legal process of making and officially, permanently, irrefutably real. And then, I paused, let the silence hold, let the room absorb the weight of what we were beginning. Then we find her a house. A job. A life. The things that were stolen from her and that we can't fully return, but that we can begin to replace, piece by piece, choice by choice, day by day. And stood up, moved to the window, stood beside me in the afternoon light that was the particular gold of Connecticut in late summer. And Monica, she asked, the name strange in her mouth, the ghost of an identity that had never been hers and was now finally, completely, permanently gone. Monica is in the system, I said, my voice flat, factual, the diagnosis of a condition that had reached its terminal stage. She will serve her sentence. She will pay her debt. And when she is released, if she is ever released, she will find a world that has moved on without her. That has forgotten her. That has replaced her, finally, with the truth she spent her life trying to escape. And nodded. Not satisfied. Not vindictive. Just acknowledging the consequence, the proportion, the justice that was imperfect but necessary. We stood in silence. Just acknowledging the consequence, the proportion, the justice that was imperfect but necessary. We stood in silence. The room behind us filling with the sounds of dinner preparation, of ordinary life, of the family that had formed around truth rather than blood, around choice rather than obligation, around the simple brutal fact of surviving what should have destroyed us. And then spoke, her voice quiet, almost hesitant, the voice of someone who wasn't used to being heard, who'd spent 35 years in waiting rooms and institutions and the margins of spaces that were never hers. Irene, she said, and my name in her mouth was new, fresh, the first time the original Monica had spoken to me and meant it as connection rather than weapon. Thank you. For finding me. For saving me. For being the sister I should have had from the beginning. I turned to face her. The green eyes flecked with brown. The face that matched our mother's but without the evasion. The body that had survived what should have killed her, that had waited in basements and institutions and the margins of a family that had erased her, that had finally been found by the sister who understood what it meant to be erased and had chosen, finally, to end the cycle. Thank yourself, I said, my voice steady, the truth that needed to be spoken. You survived. You waited. You kept the photograph, the birth certificate, the proof that you existed. I didn't find you. I just opened a door that you had already built. A door that Monica tried to keep closed. A door that our mother tried to keep closed. A door that our father is still learning to approach. And smiled. Small. Sad. Real. Then we'll open it together, she said. From now on. Whatever comes. Whatever choices. Whatever family we become. I nodded. Not promising. Not performing. Just acknowledging the choice, the possibility, the future that was opening in front of us, unexpected, unplanned, uncontrolled by anyone but ourselves. We moved to the kitchen. Ruth stirred something on the stove. Nathan set the table. Hippocrates thumped his tail, optimistic about dinner, about crumbs, about the simple brutal fact of being known. And I stood in the doorway, the width I chose, the control that had always been mine, watching the family that had formed around truth rather than blood, around choice rather than obligation, around the survival of two women who had been supposed to be dead and were finally, completely, permanently alive. The door stayed open. The evening light shifted through the window. The coffee cooled in the mugs. The dinner steamed on the stove. And somewhere in the city, in a cell, in the system, in the truth that had finally become too heavy to hide, the woman who had stolen my sister's name was learning what it meant to be nothing. To be no one. To be the space between the original and the replacement, finally empty of both. That was the ending. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just the simple brutal fact of consequences arriving, of choices mattering, of the door opening only as wide as I chose and no wider. I moved into the kitchen. Picked up a plate. Set it on the table, next to the others, the careful distribution of a woman who had learned to make space for everyone who chose to show up without performance, without condition, without the need to control the story. And sat down. Ruth sat down. Nathan sat down. I sat down last, the host, the doctor, the chief, the sister, the daughter who had finally stopped waiting to be chosen and had chosen herself. Hippocrates settled under the table, his head on my foot, his breathing steady, his presence the constant that needed no words. We ate in silence. The food simple, warm, enough. The family new, fragile, real. The future unwritten, uncontrolled, finally ours. And when the meal was done, when the plates were cleared, when the evening settled into the particular stillness of a house that had become a home, I moved to the window one last time. Looked out at the darkness. At the street where my father's car had sat, where he had nodded and driven away, where he would return or not depending on choices that were his and not mine. The door was still open. The width I chose. The control that Monica had tried to steal and that I had finally, completely, permanently reclaimed. I closed it halfway. Not all the way. Just enough to mark the boundary, to claim the space, to remind myself that the width was mine to decide, today and every day, for the rest of the life I was building. And then I turned back to the room. To Anne. To Ruth. To Nathan, who stood in the kitchen doorway, his face calm, his hand steady, his presence the constant that made everything else possible. Tomorrow, I said, my voice steady, the voice that had carried me through 1,000 emergency rooms, 100 confrontations, the 5 years of silence that had finally ended in noise and truth and the simple brutal fact of being known. Tomorrow, and repeated, and her voice matched mine, steady, certain, the voice of someone who had spent 35 years waiting and was finally, completely, permanently ready to begin. The light shifted. The night deepened. The house held its breath. And I understood, with the clarity that only comes in moments of stillness, that this was the ending. Not the trial. Not the sentence. Not the confession or the arraignment or the carefully documented evidence. This was the ending. The ordinary moment. The choice to close the door halfway. The choice to let in the people who showed up without performance, without condition, without the need to control the story. The choice to be, finally, completely, permanently, the architect of my own life. I moved to the light switch. Turned it off. Let the darkness hold us, the four of us, the family that had formed around truth rather than blood, around choice rather than obligation, around the simple brutal fact of surviving what should have destroyed us. And in the darkness, Anne's voice, quiet, certain, the last words of a story that had started with a lie and ended with the truth that had finally become too heavy to hide. The door is closed, she said. But not locked. That's the difference, isn't it? Between prison and home. Between Monica and us. Between the story she told and the truth we finally became. I nodded in the darkness. Not answering. Not performing. Just acknowledging the truth that had finally, completely, permanently arrived. The door was closed. But not locked. And the key was mine.